Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, I'm the RSA's Chief Executive. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here for this evening's special event. Could you make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent? We're filming the event for posterity and we're also live streaming over the RSA website, so welcome to our online viewers. The hashtag for tonight's event is RSA Cruddas if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. Now, housekeeping notice is over. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's event. As part of our contribution to public debate ahead of next year's general election, the RSA is inviting key politicians from the main political parties to think about the future, and particularly how radical change in society and technology might change the way we think about politics, policy, and social change. This links to the RSA's own emerging worldview, The Power to Create, which will be the focus of my annual lecture next week. I'm delighted that we're starting that series of talks about the future with Jon Cruddas MP. Jon is head of Labour's Policy Review and a member of the Shadow Cabinet. He's been a member of Parliament since 2001, first for Dagenham and then for Dagenham and Rainham. The structure for today's session is that Jon will speak for around 20-25 minutes. I'm going to ask him 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor, and we'll finish promptly at 7:30 p.m. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jon Cruddas.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Matthew, for the invitation to speak this evening. Not least because the RSA is the correct place to take a longer view of the Labour Party, of government, and the future of our country. I should say, as an aside, before I start, actually, anyone covertly recording this for Tory Central Office can have a night off, because it is being live streamed. So you can stand down now. I'll begin with a story. My long-term collaborator and friend, Jonathan Rutherford, and I have a favourite book, which tells a story, really, about the Crow Indians. It's a book by the fantastic American philosopher, Jonathan Lear from Chicago. It's called Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. It's a story about what happens when the economy of a society is destroyed and people's way of life literally comes to an end. It was told by their great chief, Plenty Coups, shortly before he died. He told an anthropologist his tribe's story. And he said, and I always like this quote, he said, "When the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not be lifted up again. After this, nothing happened." After this, nothing happened. What did he mean by that? The culture that gave life meaning and purpose had died. The whole fabric of their belief system and standards was destroyed, and that loss was literally irreparable. What could come next after that? Actually, the Crow Indian did survive despite this loss because their leadership reimagined their future, reimagined their role. It created a radical hope for the future. It was radical because it was a future that without guarantees, and most important, it was without despair. So it wasn't a messianic form of leadership. It wasn't a desperate form of leadership. It was a radical form built on hope. And in a period of rapid social and economic change, it raises key questions about how we draw on a community's memory and traditions to define the future. The book draws up many challenges for all today's political parties. For example, the Labour Party is the product of industrial society, a party built on mass production over 100 years ago, a large, stable workforce, large production units, mass consumption, and a class society. Yet we are now in the middle of a deindustrializing revolution, fragmenting the communities we sought to sustain. A post-industrial economy is taking shape around our advanced manufacturing and the new information and communication technologies. The shift to a service economy is flattening out old hierarchical command and control structures. Digital technology is unseating whole industries and workforces, and production is becoming more networked and disorganized. Our class system is being reconstituted. The disruption of technological change is greater than at any time since the Industrial Revolution. So the institutions and solidarities workers created to defend themselves against their dispossession, against the power of capital, have disappeared or become outdated and ineffective. As such, social democracy has lost its social anchorage in the coalitions built up around the skilled working class. Once great ruling parties can appear hollowed out, in danger of shrinking into a professionalized political class. Moreover, often in government, they were not very social nor very democratic. Top-down, state-driven, compensating for the system, not reforming it. A politics about structures and not about individuals. Arguably, this model of social democracy was built in the industrial era, but has come to the end of its useful life. But these forces also challenge the Tories as well, and their traditional conservative values. The dominant force over the last 30 years has been an ideology of neoclassical economics, arguably since the 1870s actually, or neoliberalism. Its market fundamentalism has driven growth, and its destructive impact is now increasingly understood. A centralizing and authoritarian state, an economy driven by individual greed, a culture of personal entitlement at the expense of a sense of obligation and duty to others, public goods commodified, communities fragmented, and our democracy weakened. And we're now living with the shakedown, with the consequences, the biggest bank bailout in our history, the slowest recovery, and the link between economic growth and rising living standards broken. Huge wealth for a few, whilst wages for the majority have been stagnant for years. Homes for ordinary families are not being built, and the skills training which business and young people need to succeed is inadequate. People's talent is wasted in dead-end jobs. There's not enough quality childcare to help women earn. The care system for the elderly is turning into a social catastrophe. Cumulatively, in 2015, George Osborne will leave the country with a deficit close to 70 billion and the national debt still rising. So here's one blindingly obvious paradox to start with. Despite the failure of the old order, we're also living in a time of tremendous opportunity. As the economy recovers, people want the opportunity to use their skills and talents to make a better life for themselves and their children. There's fantastic energy and willingness to create and to build and to turn Britain around. So, is there not two future stories taking shape in our country today? The first is the future of innovation and wealth creation. We are just at the start of the internet revolution. Radical innovations in the generation, processing and transmission of information will continue modernising the whole base of our economy. New services, products and markets will mean more knowledge, prosperity and opportunity. The web is breaking down barriers. Digital technologies have transformed start-up costs, and it's never been easier to start and run your own business. For example, new platforms like Etsy are opening up global markets to small businesses and the self-employed. Kickstarter provides crowdsourcing for inventors of every kind. And Unbound brings together potential investors and authors to create subscription finance publications. New creative cultures will generate economic wealth and deepen and enrich our experience of everyday life, expanding the sphere of human freedom and expression. Cities were at the centre of the first industrial revolution, with Manchester literally the first modern city. They will drive the new economic revolution across the world. In Britain, our cities will accelerate the forces of economic development, with better infrastructure and digital connectivity and good skills and employment strategies. They will play to the creative strengths of the people. But without radical reform to our economy, this future will only belong to the few. There is a second future taking up shape in the shadow of this first one. A country scarred by dispossession. Its great industries gone, and with them, the skilled jobs and communities of the working class. People driven from secure full-time work into precarious, badly paid jobs. Poverty and inequality increasing, especially amongst the under-30s. Public services standardised, treating their users like supplicants, almost victims. Social mobility ground to a halt, the younger generation competing for fewer jobs and shut out of the housing market. 1/5 of children leaving primary school without achieving a basic level of numeracy or literacy. 10 million people lacking basic digital skills. So, the rapid pace of social economic change has left millions behind and they feel abandoned. So, as someone once said, are we not living in the best of times and the worst of times? For sure, the future direction we choose for our country will be decided by politics or the political sphere. But our system of government is failing people. Instead of sharing power, it hoards it. Those who make decisions on our behalf, whether they be in Westminster, Brussels, in business, the media, working in the public sector, are often too unaccountable. People feel powerless to contribute and make their voices heard. So, government has to change, and yet there will be more public spending cuts to come. So we literally cannot afford the status quo. Now, I believe that Labour, together with a wider orbit of social and progressive movements, will define and shape the political settlement of the coming decade. We defined, actually, the dominant political settlement of the 20th century. We built our welfare state. It was a profound achievement, but too often we settled for that. The ideology and the institutions of 70 years ago became the horizon of our ambition. Confronted by neoliberalism, the destructive capacity of that force, in the 80s we sometimes just defended institutions and ideas that were often offering diminishing returns. We became institutionally conservative, defending often the outdated. So, self-evidently, we will not build a new economy with the old politics of command and control. Central government, big bureaucracies and corporations faced with complexity and unpredictability are all losing the power they once had to shape our world. Our welfare state is ill-equipped to deal with modern social evils like loneliness, the loss of community, a sense of anomie, alienation. Our health service is struggling to cope with the rise of chronic illnesses like depression, obesity, diabetes, and we literally lack a proper system of care for our growing elderly population. So, our political parties cannot keep up with our complex and fast-changing society. In the new economy, politics will be about innovation and participation, about networks, not hierarchies. Parties will not win power in government. They'll have to create power by building partnerships and wider public involvement. Instead of imposing change on communities, politicians will need to use their insights and experience of what works and what doesn't. We'll be conveners, actually, bringing people together to help them find solutions to the problems they face. Now, these are insights that you are making here at the RSA, Matthew, in your excellent work around the power to create, and I really applaud it, and we're studying it very closely. Just as in the age of steam and the age of the railways, our new digital age is radically changing society. But while rail transformed society, it also created opportunities for the robber barons to monopolize and control it for their own good. We have to tackle concentrations of power and make sure people have the skills and the abilities to take advantage of the internet. In the vanguard of the new economy, there is a new productive force, which is the life of the mind. There are new kinds of raw materials, the intangible assets of information, sounds, words, images, ideas, and they're produced in creative, emotional, and intellectual labor. New modes of production are using consumers and their relationships in the co-inventing of new ideas, products, and actual cultural meaning itself. People no longer just want to consume the culture and the products handed to them from on high. Technology, from computer-aided design to the new 3D printing, will provide individuals with the means to actively create culture and pursue creative forms of labor. Individuals will be able to design and make the things they live with. So, to develop these opportunities throughout the population, we need an education system that actually nurtures and cultivates the full range of human capabilities. Our present model of education rewards conformity in pursuit of a narrow, logical, and mathematical form of intelligence. It fails too many children and it reproduces the power of the already privileged. It is wasteful of our most important economic resource, which is actually our human ingenuity itself. We need to give craft and vocational work the same value and status as academic work, and prioritize digital inclusion to help adults who lack digital skills make the most of the internet. Now, the future represents a powerful challenge to my party. Historically, our instincts have too often been to centralize, to conform, and to control. To shape the future of our country, we in Labour know that we have to do things very, very differently. It is literally about rethinking socialism. Now, I've always been ready to admit I'm on the more romantic and, dare I say, conservative side of socialism. The conservative radicalism of John Ruskin, the romanticism of William Morris, the ILP itself, George Lansbury, our greatest ever Labour leader, E.P. Thompson, one that values the local, the parochial, and the magical as sources of political agency and power. Actually, Dylan Thomas once said, he said the Labour movement at its best was both magical and parochial. Its magic was derived from being anchored in the everyday tempo of the communities it sought to represent. Magical and parochial. We built our future on these patterns of the past. Labour's traditions lie in the popular movements of collective self-help and improvement, the temperance societies, holiday clubs, cooperatives, riding schools, the trade unions. Before we became the party of the state, we were a movement, developing leadership, organising people, creating power as a currency. Therefore, why don't we confront the future through these traditions? Own our own history. It was Chesterton who said, actually, that tradition is the democracy of the dead. We should own our own traditions and our history. That democracy of the labour movement, go back to it to chart the future. Put it this way, our values grew out of our religious roots, as Harold Wilson often said. So let me begin the new with the old. Luke 17, verses 20 to 21. The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed, nor will they say, look, here it is. Or, there it is. For behold, the kingdom of God is within you. The power to change our lives lives deep within each and every one of us. The political theorist, Roberto Unger, makes this point. The institutions and structures we build make us who we are. But, as he says, they are finite and we are not. There is always more in us, more capability of insight, of production, of emotion, of association than there is in them. We are, says Unger, context-transcending spirits. Tonight's first political soundbite. I'm sure it will catch on. Now, the socialism for me is about this power within. This freedom to aspire and to find self-fulfillment is part of our modern consciousness. It is individual, but it is not selfish. It involves the right of everyone to achieve their own unique way of being human, to self-realise, self-actualise. To dispute this right in others is to fail to live within its own terms. And it is a mutual recognition that we're all dependent upon other people throughout our lives, not an atomised group of isolated, transacting individuals. We need one another to succeed individually. In our industrial society, solidarity called upon an underlying shared identity and a common economic interest. But it's no longer so effective in our diverse society of individuals. We need to create new models of interdependency. I would suggest reciprocity, which establishes a sense of justice in relationships. There was an old famous Jewish Hillel's Golden Rule, where a non-believer came up to Rabbi Hillel and said, we will convert to your religion if you can recite the scriptures, to which he just stood on one leg and just said, do not do unto others as they'd not have them do to you. The rest is commentary, he said. The rest is commentary. So do not do unto others as you'd not have them do to you. And a renewed idea of fraternity, which, unlike solidarity, recognises the diversity between equals. So, for me, these define a politics that is both radical and conservative, a mix of new and blue Labour, may I suggest. The socialism of the future will be out creating power together for individual freedom, a future worth making. Now, Labour's policy review has been working on a programme of national renewal in a time when there is no money to spare. Labour has been learning lessons from the past. For government over the last 30 years has often failed to meet the challenges of our time. The old mechanical model of public administration will not work in the future of complex problems. It has no solutions to the pressing problems of our time. Isolation, loneliness, family breakdown, the decline in trust. People are losing confidence in the ability of our public institutions to serve the collective interest. So, we'll need to redefine the relationship between government and individuals, renewing our institutions step by step, learning as we go about what works, building dialogue and partnership, promising less, asking more of people. It was Tawney that once said, after Labour literally crawled from the wreckage of 1931, in a famous essay called The Choice Before the Labour Party, he said, Labour always promises too much and asks for too little. It's a very interesting phrase in terms of what it encapsulates in terms of our history. The role of government therefore, will be to use its authority to create power for change, leverage capacity, generating momentum and negotiating between different interests to secure the common good of society. Designing policy will involve deliberation and co-creation with those who will be affected. Why shouldn't they design the systems? Giving people more control of their lives rather than pulling levers from Whitehall. So, how about 3 standards for a prosperous democracy? The first standard being an inclusive economy. An inclusive economy that's pro-worker, pro-business, pro-aspiration. Labour will reform the institutions of our economy to deal with the causes of our economic problems. And we will devolve power to our cities to unleash their economic potential. Any cursory look at comparative economic performance signals that cities are the key drivers in terms of modern growth strategy. We'll grow our way out of austerity, boosting science and technology for innovation, boosting small and medium-sized businesses, boosting our infrastructure, increased trade, reshaping the relationship between finance and the productive economy to deliver more patient capital. People want decent jobs that are well paid. So we'll build dialogue between workers and employers to create partnerships for improving both business performance and pay and job quality. We'll tackle low pay and set up employer-led skills training and a national system of vocational education. Sharing power with people to give them more control over their lives includes over the work they do. Now, the second element is about an inclusive society. We all know that emotional life is at the heart of the relationships that bind society together, and family is the cornerstone, the bedrock. Government can help bring security and stability to society by investing in families. So Labour will invest to prevent social problems developing and so save money in the long term. We'll take a whole family approach to policy that uses the power of relationships to strengthen the capacity of men, women and children for resilience, love, care. That includes valuing the role of fathers at home as much as mothers at work, and helping families balance their work and home commitments by extending free childcare. People need more control over their health and care, and so bringing health and social care together in a whole-person approach is a major priority for the next Labour government. Instead of leaving older people helpless and dependent, we'll help families and communities to work with professionals to support them at home and to help them manage their long-term health problems. Relationships transforms people's lives, and so our policies will be designed to involve people as genuine partners in shaping their services around their individual needs. Of course, an inclusive society thrives with self-confident citizens, muscular citizens. So our education system needs to include character development across the curriculum, helping children to develop the emotional skills, self-esteem, and relationship to live more rewarding, flourishing lives. We'll benchmark our public policy on whether or not it adds social value, fosters reciprocity for a sense of fairness and justice, and increases individual and community resilience in the face of adversity and turbulence of the modern world. All roads lead back to questions of democracy and power. So the third standard is an inclusive politics. Politics is about empowering individuals and their families in the work they do and in the places they live. Yet we've got a trickle-down economy and a trickle-down government. So Labour will share more power and responsibility with people, increasing the power of local places by building collaboration amongst public services and organisations and pooling funds to stop inefficiency and avoid duplication. This is happening in real time all across the country, forced on by the scale of the retrenchment. It means that we have to innovate and create. We will also develop the government digital service to drive change across government, standardising data, improving sharing between departments and encouraging innovation. Our traditional pools of policy making, as Matthew knows more than anyone, money and top-down government regulation stifles people's agency and initiative, and are too often actually totally ineffective as well. Parties will need to build networks to connect with the greater array of small-scale innovations in society that are pioneering new directions in terms of policy. In the future, reform will need to engage more with people's behaviour and cultures, and will mean mobilising people on the ground for change. So the internet is changing the nature of the public sphere. It can be used to rebalance power between citizens and the market, and between citizens and the state. But we will address the problems of concentrations of power, child safety, privacy, and data security. I tend to always think about this in terms of national renewal itself. Any cursory reading of history says that Labour only wins when it contests the national story effectively. 45, 64, 97. That's what we have to do again. This morning in Leeds, my colleague Andrew Adonis set out our Labour's strategy for national economic renewal if we win in 2015. It will begin with the biggest devolution of power to our cities and county regions in 100 years, bringing government much closer to the people. It will establish regional banking, local powers over high streets, people-powered public services, and top-class system of vocational education and training tailored for local need. It will bring affordable homes to our sons and daughters, so if they choose, they can live in places they grew up. Labour councils like Leeds are already drawing up, together with local public, private and third sector, data to literally redesign their cities based on open data flows. And we'll foster the creativity that's seen Tech City grow in London, and we'll repeat it in other English cities. 20 years ago this month, Tony Blair took hold of my party and made us face the future. Matthew and I remember it. He spoke back then of building a new era in an old country. We face the same challenges today in tougher times. Now, Ed Miliband will deliver on this vision in the new digital age. Our policy review is the engine for these ideas, for new thinking and facing the challenges of the future. Think in terms of my party's history. Labour built its history organising working people to defend the integrity of their family lives, to struggle for fair wages and a decent home, and to create a better future for their children. And aspirational politics about bread and butter issues. That makes still remain the fundamentals for a decent life. But to this tradition, we must make a prophetic story of human possibility for the new times within which we inhabit. Self-evidently, we do not live in the future. We live now in the only life we will ever know. Our prophetic story is about how together we can create a world in which each of us can live life to the full. How each of us can live a good life. To achieve it in the time we have, our highest good. We'll call it radical hope. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, John. There was a huge amount there. I'm just going to take up 5 minutes of your time to ask 3 or 4 questions before we open it up. The first really starts where you finished, which is this balance between, as it were, the kind of retail politics of tax cuts and price freezes and these kind of very material offers that are made, and this debate about the future. I guess it's understandable politicians haven't talked much about the future in recent years because of economic crisis and austerity. It might have seemed complacent or out of touch. So really my first question is just to ask you, do you think that space, that discussion of the future, the possibility that there are different futures on offer is going to open up between now and the next election, or are we going to more or less stay where we are now in a kind of slightly tit-for-tat retail space?
It's always very good call to praise your host when you're making... just as you were asking that question, I remember something you wrote quite recently when you said there's 3 elements to politics. One is questions of values. The second is questions of competence, and the third is the question of the future. And your thesis was, Labour's ahead on the values, it's behind on the competence, and no one owns the future. And I think that's quite a good prism through which to operate it. I think, for our purposes, to be fairly blunt, and I'll be fairly honest, when I was very generously invited to do our policy review by our leader, the basic charge at the time was, literally, you have no policies. Right? It was a blank sheet of paper. So we had to build a system that could sort of deal with that in the short and build in the short term, and then build a bigger story of national renewal in the medium term. Partly because if you go back to 45, 64, 97, Labour only wins when it contests the national story. It's only really won 3 times, right? So 45, it was about counterposing the future, homes for heroes, versus the 30s as a period of mass unemployment and appeasement, and the Tories. 64, scientific and technological challenges facing the country with Harold Wilson, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume running around his grouse moor. 97, it was about economic and social modernisation with Tony Blair versus drift decline, and Labour successfully charted that national story of hope versus decline. Right? That's what we have to do, because self-evidently Labour has only won when it's done that. So we have to do that and forge a future story, right? But we are.
Open up for, I mean, it's trite to attack the media, but is the media going to allow that kind of conversation about alternative futures? Which
Does the media crowd that out? I sort of, from recent experience, there is an element that I would say it does. You know, that you can't. How can you develop that proper conversation of having a centre-right and a centre-left conversation about the future trajectory of the country? That's what politics should and actually is all about, really. But at the moment, well, we're in transition. Over the next month, you're going to see major planks of footings in the ground built around us. Next Monday, we've got a big project around statecraft and democracy and citizenship, which Richard Leese from Manchester City Council has been doing a fantastic piece of work. We have the Adonis Review. Just the other week, the independent IPPR came out with a really interesting analysis of what social democracy is when there's no money. And these are really trying to reimagine or rethink what the centre-left is all about. And that is basically about social policy, economic policy, and questions of democracy building into a story of national renewal. And that's where we have to be and where we will be. I take your point about have we got a society, especially given the media, have we got the capacity to have that mature conversation? I think we do. I'm a romantic about these things, but I think we can. And we have to, because we win. We can win when we do that.
You didn't mention a distinction, which I think I've heard you use before, which is the distinction that Peter Clarke, the historian, makes between two models of progressive change: the mechanical, which is about power and policy, and the moral, which is around values and mobilisation. And I wonder whether you agree that something interesting has happened in the modern world, because of the nature of the modern world, which is that it felt for a long time as though the mechanical view was the modern view. The modern view was about power and policy and bureaucracy and strategy and all that. And the idea of moral renewal was an old-fashioned, kind of Victorian kind of idea.
Absolutely.
But actually in the modern world, because of the problems of policy making in a complex world, because of the failure of people's trust in institutions, for example, actually it turns out that it is precisely around values and mobilisation that change really happens. And it may be that the moral side is the modern story and the mechanical one is the one that's out of date.
Right. And that is especially acute for us, coming out of 13 years in power. How can we reimagine a more ethical... Tawney said... I mean, Crossland's Future of Socialism, I think it delineated 15 types of socialism, right? There's 15 different sort of types. Actually, Tawney, before that, cut through all that and says there's two. There's economistic and there's ethical. And I think that's quite a similar proxy. And the whole history of the Labour Party really is a contest between two basic traditions. One, the Fabian Society created in 1893. The other, the ILP, 1894. One was more provincial, parochial, romantic, ethical. The Fabian tradition was more statist, mechanistic, and this is a caricature of Fabianism because it's a much more rich, textured thing. But that basic fault line is one that exists within all political parties and all political traditions, and it's a tussle between them. So, you know, there is. I used this the other week. There is this Robert Frost, the poet, says to Jack Kennedy, 2 days after, he'd given a poem, he'd written a poem for Kennedy's inauguration, 61, and it talked about an era of poetry and power. You know, and he said to Kennedy, as he's leaving White House 2 days after the inauguration, he pulled Kennedy aside and he said, "You have to be more Irish than Harvard." Right, you have to be, because it's that tussle within us between the mechanistic, the transactional, the policy calculus, the rational choice theory, and the more romantic reimagination of political traditions. And I actually think the more contemporary one now is the more romantic one, which goes back into can you tell that national story around that? Now, I might be seen as naive and somewhat romantic as a criticism rather than as a source of hope and possibility. But, you know, that's...
Two more brief questions to me, because I know people are itching to jump in. But can political parties, given the competitive nature of politics, given the way in which frankness is presented as, shooting oneself in the foot, is it possible for them to be the kinds of organisations that work in the 21st century, and particularly the kinds of organisations that young people want to join? Don't they just have to be kind of hierarchical, controlling bureaucracies? And, you know, as we know, I mean, I think you've got a teenage son. Young people don't want to join organisations like that.
Yeah, the jury's out on it. I don't know, really. I mean, I sense that they will have to become much more porous, agile things, you know, that people move in and out of, and that embrace different ideas and traditions. Now, that is hugely countercultural for the architecture of Westminster, arguably.
Well, that's how it works in America, of course. In a way,
Well, it is, yeah.
Political parties don't exist, and then they rally around a candidate,
Yeah.
and they're a kind of social movement behind the candidate, and then they disperse again. Is that?
They're sort of purchased as well by, you know.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, there is you know, but they do swarm in and out, don't they?
Yeah.
They have that sort of fluid dynamic. I quite like that because the world is a complex place and it's becoming more and more complex, and the cross currents mean that people will not. I mean, I'm sort of tribally Labour, right? That's my gang. That's how I think. I'm afraid. No, not afraid. That is how I think. It's my team. You know, I'm a Portsmouth fan. You know, that is my. You know, and I'm attached to these sorts of things. But people aren't, and I sort of know that. So, how do you create that agility? As a now, we are returning, just as we talk about the different forms of policy development, we're also returning to different forms of mobilisation and organisation away from, we were both heavily involved in the Labour Party when it could have been characterised as far too top-down, domineering, authoritarian in terms of its political culture. That was a criticism that some of us heard from time to time.
Yeah.
And we
although if you thought it, you got shot.
But we have to unpack all of that, and that's a real task, isn't it? How you do that is a really interesting challenge. But we have a new general secretary who's trying to test drive new ideas of freeing up, letting go, trying to loosen it all up, and re-inviting people into the conversations at local level, and that has to be the future. It's a long haul to change the culture of a party, or the character of a party, you know.
I'll ask you just finally, as we set up here, two middle-aged men, can I just ask you finally about what do you think is happening with young people? There's this really interesting, in a way, slightly contradictory evidence from sort of opinion polling. On the one hand, this is a more individualistic generation. You know, they kind of feel you have to do it yourself. They're not particularly interested in paternalism. They're quite sceptical about the state. They're quite sceptical about collectivism in a traditional sense. On the other hand, last week we saw that a huge proportion of those people say the values of the companies they work for matter to them. The RSA's own work has shown that those young people are very enthusiastic about working for themselves, and they don't want to do it for the money. I mean, they'd like to get the money, but it's to do with autonomy, it's to do with the sense of purpose. What's your reading of young people's attitudes, and do you think the political class as a whole kind of understands them?
I thought you bowled some underarm questions at me for a bit rather than this. I mean, oh God. I got a 21-year-old, and he just laughs at me a lot when I try to talk about politics. It's just because he just zones out of it. But he's very radical, and in terms of he's a real Democrat, and he's really interested in broader social movements, technological capacity, music, you know, culture, you know, very active as a citizen, as a political agent, but he doesn't really join the dots into Labour in and around that, you know. And that's where the laughter and the humour and he takes the piss, really, in terms of. So how do we do that? I mean, that goes back to the question of what political parties are, doesn't it?
It seems to me young people are more motivated.
Totally.
More motivated, more angry, more desiring of change, possibly, than they have been.
Well, they're picking up the tab, aren't they? Intergenerationally, the intergenerational transfer is of a type that is unprecedented, I think, in terms of that sense of them picking up for this huge shakedown, the bill, the tab, and quite rightly that they should have some voice then. And I think there is this question of an emerging sort of sense of responsibility for them to articulate a sense of how they own that in the future. And that is hugely interesting. I mean, it's up to them, isn't it? I mean, really, it's not. It's the two middle-aged blokes up on stage telling them what they think. It's probably counter to what we were trying to talk about earlier.
Let's take 2 or 3 questions from we'll take them in kind of groups of 2 or 3 if that's all right, John. And I'm not taking questions from journalists, if that's all right. I mean, if you happen to be a journalist in your past, we'll forgive you that, but not journalistic questions, you know what I mean? It's an RSA event, that's not the kind of thing we do. Okay, so there's a gentleman here. Wait for the mic.
Sorry. I'm Matthew Reid, I'm Chief Executive of the Children's Society. For people who are less sort of tribally aligned with politics, do you think the Labour Party will be able to lay out a vision for the next election which combines running a sensible economy without hanging the poor out to dry?
Okay, hold on to that one. And then behind you. Malcolm, you're not asking a journalistic question, are you? No.
John, fantastic. Terrific about trying to create equal status between academic and vocational education. As you all know, we tried that we had royal commissions in the 1860s saying that. They went to Germany, Italy and France. We tried it again in 45, but we only had 20% going to grammar school and the other 4 failing. And again, Germany and Italy and France way, way ahead. How are we going to do it now because it's not cheap?
Okay, and then we'll take the... sorry, I just want a lady to mix the group, mix the gender up on the questioning. So there we are. And then I'll come to you next.
Hi, Laura Patel from The Times. I'm afraid I am a journalist.
No, you're going to ask a journalistic type question, are you?
Afraid so.
No, well, no, we'll take the gentleman down here then. That's all right. Sorry. You'll have to...
So much for progressive politics for a new era.
You'll have to grab him at the end. It's fine. It's just, it can't do one of, do you really mean this kind of question? Right, anyway, yeah, there you are.
You focus very heavily on domestic challenges, and understandably so. But where arguably the last Labour government came totally unstuck was obviously in foreign affairs, international affairs. Labour Party's internationalism, where's the vision on that? How do you envisage the country's place in the world, in Europe too? Are we going to see the leader reverse his position on a European referendum, for example?
So 3 simple questions for you there, John. They're all kind of, you can make a speech on all of them, but answer them as quickly as you can so we can take 2 or 3 more sets of questions.
The question of technology and education. I think, I remember, I don't know, 30 years ago, there was a big debate around the centre-left around whether we were living through new times. It was partly about a lot of debates around the part of the Labour Party and a lot of the ex-Communist Party, people like Stuart Hall and Marxism Today, and they were sort of trying to reimagine social democracy around a radical democracy and radical economic redesign, etc. But arguably that failed, or was 30 years too early, because it didn't have the technology. Right? And this is something that Neil Lawson from Compass, many of you know, he's doing an awful lot of work on this, and he's actually going to publish a manifesto for New Times over the next few weeks, whereby actually now, because of the technology, we have that possibility to rethink patterns of learning, pedagogy, patterns of character formation and resilience, and moving much more agile between different forms of education, and actually different courses and how they're modularized and how you can use MOOCs and all of this sort of stuff. So I think actually the time for radical redesign around the education process has never been greater, actually. And I take your point about the failures of the past in terms of previous epochs, but they've tried to do that. But I just think that, I mean, I don't know, I'm on a pretty steep learning curve here because I'm on sort of the end of the wrong end of the digital spectrum in terms of my literacy, you know what I mean? But I'm sort of, I listen to an awful lot of people who are at the other end, and the potentials of this are magnificent, not as just a digital bolt-on, but the fact that we live and inhabit this world now, and it is totally tilting it all. And that actually gives you, I think, real opportunities around questions of economic policy aligned to a modern programme of social justice. I mean, the Condition of Britain project that the IPPR produced a couple of weeks ago is fantastic in terms of organising principles about the evidence base around long-term preventative work to deal with, rather than back-end fiscal transfers that mediate the worst elements of social problems, long-term co-production projects, radical devolution, really strong themes in terms of reconciling both economic growth models and new forms of social policy in a cold climate economically. What do you do when there's little money about, and how you can lock in long-term interventions that actually in the long term save you money as well. There's an awful lot of work there. So I think I'm more optimistic than I've been for a very long time about the Labour Party coming up with a model using opposition properly to really rethink what it's for. And you'll see over the next month a lot more of that. And that will include foreign policy as well. Douglas Alexander's doing an awful lot of thinking around what is, what is a modern duty to protect, for example, given and given the shakedown of Iraq. How do you return to some of these issues? Very complicated, very difficult. But where I sit, I'm just like the secretary for our policy work, right? And so I just see loads of really interesting policy work all across the front that will gradually be layered out in public. And actually, it cumulatively will be a big story of national transformation. Big change without big money is
My sense is that Douglas would echo this notion that we have to rethink the very nature of policy, the notion of foreign policy itself,
right?
As you and I discussed, like domestic policy,
right?
In a way, that
that would be a really interesting.
Which is kind of applying something to
come and listen
world.
to that, because he is doing an awful lot of stuff around that space, and I think I won't say more than that at the moment. We have some for our policy forum in 18th to 20th of July, which is basically the first cut of our draft manifesto programme, agreed by the internal stakeholders of the party. A core element of that will be our future shape of our policy, internationalism, a renewed internationalism, if you want. And some of the issues about duty, obligation, fraternity are transportable out of the domestic thing into the international one as well.
Okay, let's take another round. Is this a Twitter question? No, a Twitter question. Appropriately enough.
Great. Okay, thanks. This is a question from Alistair Cruikshank via Twitter. He asks, why extend free childcare? Would it not be better to have a livable wage and have one-income families?
Hold on to that. Yep.
Thanks. A good friend and colleague of mine mentioned, who's a member of the Young Fabians, mentioned you've got some really good views on equality. Given that, would you mind giving us your definitions of the difference between the left and the right at the moment? What really, undercutting the policy, what does it really come down to?
Great. Another simple question. I'm just, I promised, with this gentleman here at the front.
Just to return to structures, looking at the policy papers, there seemed to be a very equivocal stance over local government. I was a councillor. It seems to me, actually, that I'd like to know what your view is about the role of local government in delivering the vision that you've just articulated.
Okay. Okay, so define the difference between left and right. Are you really committed to localism? And I've forgotten the first one already. Oh, yes.
And it was, is it either or, childcare or living wage? Is that, well, I don't think it's either or. There's a rather obvious answer.
But you don't think you should return to the family wage notion of a man going out to work and the woman being
No, of course not. I mean, the living wage, I'm really interested in this question. This question, the question of a living wage is really interesting in terms of the question of policy making. Because it come out of a load of debates in East London and within the faith communities about, amongst families, about what they needed to keep their family together, right? So it didn't drop out of the sky from a think tank. It was built around conversations, around things that people needed, right? And out of that, and then there was marches on Canary Wharf in terms of some of the banks, in terms of they should pay their cleaners a living wage. That's the origins of that policy. It's a really interesting example that goes with the grain of some of the things we're talking about, how you can innovate around the public space in terms of policy making itself. So I don't think it's the sort of either or thing. In terms of the local government, you're going to see a report next Monday on very dryly entitled Local Government Innovation Task Force report. But it is a fantastic piece of work about it's almost like how can you innovate? The financial contraction forces innovation to get out of silos and departments and then reconfigure services around families and groups. And that's the driver for really radical change across the country. Left and right, actually. And I think there's a real source of energy outside of Whitehall in terms of new forms of statecraft that are appearing all over the place. And so we're going to be doing an awful lot around this over the
and
months.
This isn't just the I mean, just to clarify, this isn't just the fashion.
No, the page has turned. No, the page has turned. I know. The usual story is well, you always talk a good game in terms of opposition, in terms of localism or whatever, or giving power away. Look, the world has changed now. But the metric around power is changing politics, where it forces an accountability of all institutions and hierarchy that purport to govern. And I think that's why I really strongly pay. I shouldn't really say this. This is where I start getting into trouble. The work of the Government Digital Service and some of their open policy making is really interesting. And we would seek to extend some of that stuff. Because there's huge, I mean, I would say their project is just built on a malign view of the state rather than being translated into a really strong form of citizenship. And our approach should be to codify that around a form of citizenship, around data and accountability and democracy. And that actually, I think, goes back to this question of the left-right thing. Because what is the differences? I would say they're around fundamental questions of democracy and agency now, where I see, under the guise of localism, an increasingly centralised political project within government. But there are some other counteracting forces, like what's happening in the Cabinet Office. But if you look in education, if you look in some of the other departments, there's this huge centralisation of power. And that's what I think has got to be unpacked, really. And that, I think, it really is the fundamental difference that we'll see emerging across between left and right.
I'm going to take 3 very short final questions, because we mustn't finish late. There's a lady right at the back of the room.
Hi, as a designer, I'm constantly optimistic that the future can be better, but always dissatisfied that the present isn't quite as good as I'd like. One of the things about the future narrative that I'm fascinated by is that when we look from a fiscal point of view, we're talking about austerity and scarcity, but when we look from a social point of view in terms of an ageing population, in terms of the number of people, the informal economy, we're in a time of abundance. So I'm really interested in the way that the networked economy will liberate that ability for people to do a lot more and actually keep our narrative really positive around abundance, so that people kind of can think that the hope, I suppose, as you say, that the future will be brighter.
Great. I almost want to finish with that. Such a lovely question.
Fantastic.
But,
I didn't even know it was a question. I thought it was
the gentleman at the back there. Yep.
Do you foresee scope for working on joint areas of interest like social services and pensions and the environment with other political parties like the Liberal Democrats or the Green Party?
Okay, that's a good question. That'll really get into trouble. And then I'll take the gentleman right at the end there, right at the back there.
Oh, man.
You can just pass sometimes.
Hopeful radicalism is a lovely phrase, but I can't see anybody using it on a doorstep in May 2015.
Sure.
Could you give us an example of something equivalent to what was used in 45 or 64 or 97, such as a minimum wage, that might be used? For instance, after 5 years of a Labour government, nobody would have to visit a food bank.
There we are. You've got 3 minutes to answer those, John.
I didn't think the first... I
just agreed with it.
Yeah, I did, totally. I think everyone did. It was just fantastic. It seems to me, I always use this, it's very boring and repetitive. That's why I always use it, I suppose. The great philosopher Raymond Williams once said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And that seems to me to be exactly what you're talking about, how you can navigate the hopeful story of national renewal when there are very difficult times and turbulent times around us. But that's where I think this question of technological capacity really does act as a key driver, if we get it right. But it is a tale of 2 possibilities, really. But that's what creates political force and energy, I think, and hope. For me, it does, anyway, in terms of the capacity to change things, which is why everyone gets in politics, anyway. In terms of across-the-aisle political dialogues, I am going to take a huge swerve around that, because that's body bag territory for me, so I'm not going to that. And So the question, well, look, this will be, look, this is strangely, because there's a fixed-term parliament, which we've never had before, it gives you a timeline into building this retail offer, as you described, or the pledge card project. And what we're doing over the next month is building a draft programme for the Labour Party, hopefully re-establish the sentiment around Labour, to confront the questions of what it's for in a very cold climate economically, and how it can still drive through radical social change and economic redesign and deeper democracy and citizenship. And out of that, we will come illustrative policies that are embedded within that story. That's what good policy making is. It's illustrative rather than a discrete policy. They tell a deeper story of where you want to take the country. And that's what you will see incrementally built over the next 10 months. And it's all to play for. We live in interesting times because no one knows the future, really. The unpredictability of it means that it's going to be quite lively.
Now, thank you, John. Just before we finish, I've got to be slightly pompous for a moment. Apparently, I'm told there's a Twitter storm of journalists complaining about me banning journalistic questions as a sign of... I won't get... The ironies are so manifold, I won't even get into them. But let me just say to my journalists, some of my best friends are journalists, as you heard from John's speech, he argued Labour's case, but we asked him to steer clear of kind of traditional kind of, bashing of the Conservatives or whatever, largely speaking, and this isn't really the forum for that kind of day-to-day political conversation. I'm sure, John, you'd be happy to talk to any journalist at the end of this.
Where's the back door?
It's we're not trying to ban the conversation, it's just trying to keep it at a certain point, but it looks like I'm condemned by a group of very dangerous people, so I'll be watching my back anyway. So thanks very much, John, for speaking. You can go and you can say to people, they'll say, well, how was it? And you say, well, it was a typical politician's talk, Dylan Thomas, Robert Frost, St. Luke, just the kind of thing you expect from a politician's talk. It's been a great speech, John. It was a fascinating conversation, a really good start for our attempt at the RSA to have more of a debate about the future as we lead up to that next general election. But please join me in thanking Jon Cruddas.
Thanks, Matthew.